Good afternoon. My name is Michael Roberts. I'm CEO and founder of Warrior to Citizen, the host for this program. We are a 10-year-old nonprofit that provides psychoeducation, counseling, coaching, and training to veteran and first responder families. Warrior to Citizen, by the way, is headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. Thanks for joining us today, exploring the many complex aspects of military and first responder families, their challenges and opportunities to grow closer as a family and simultaneously manage a stress-filled career. Our previous webinars can be reviewed on our website or Facebook sites. Each of the subjects covered in the Warrior to Citizen webinars provides a window into lessons learned from mental health professionals and chaplains who specialize in the unique character of the veteran and first responder family. This Warrior Citizen webinar series sets out to help to strengthen families to better deal with the COVID-19 crisis and its after effects. During this unprecedented time, families of the service members and first responders face extreme challenges. We believe today's subject matter experts will offer a dialogue that opens communication, deepens family relationships, fosters healing, and encourages resiliency. Change does start at home. Our desire and mission is to support families and to strengthen bonds. If our webinars are of interest, please share them with others. Please also let us know if you have any questions in the future. Contact us at info@warrior2citizen.org. Be sure to use the numeral 2. Please note that our website and Facebook site describes our program offerings and information about our coming and past events. So without further delay, I'm proud to introduce today the moderator for this program. General Douglas Carver is a very good friend, former Chief of the Army Chaplains, and served our nation for over 30 years in uniform. Presently, he is the director at the North American Mission Board, leading over 3,000 chaplains. General Carver is also on the Warrior Citizen Board of Directors, and he will introduce our subject matter experts on staff. Thank you, Doug.
Mike, thank you for that introduction, and let me welcome all of you who have taken the time this afternoon to join us for this fourth of 5 webinars that we are hosting with Warrior to Citizen. The title of this webinar series is COVID-19 from Crisis to Growth in Community, and our previous webinars are available online for you to listen to. Our first one, we dealt with strengthening our family ties. Secondly, finding calm in the storm of life's challenges. The last time we gathered, we focused on conflict resolution and the importance in that particular area. And today we're talking about a very important topic that probably all of us have to deal with at some point in our life, and it's on brokenness. We have 2 subject matter experts who will be addressing brokenness from their particular area of expertise. I'd like to first of all welcome Dr. John Wheeler. John's a former Navy SEAL, Christian counselor who focuses on healing trauma. Often that trauma that's experienced by our veterans, first responders, our law enforcement officers, as well as their family members. John specializes in moral injury. He has a doctorate in counseling and education, as well as a master's degree in theology. John serves as an adjunct at Mercer and Richmond Graduate University, where he offers a number of courses to our veterans, especially those pursuing a degree in counseling psychology. Our next panelist is Chaplain Lou Kuhn. He's a founder of Armed Forces Mission, and he's a special projects liaison for HealthLink, serving the Georgia Crisis and Access Line. Lou was inducted into the University of North Georgia's Alumni Association back in 2018, and in 2016, he received the Trinity Awards Emergency Responder of the Year for his work in suicide intervention, where he conducted over 1,200 suicide interventions, and he also trained over 17,000 men and women to do the same. Lou has a Master's of Divinity in Education. He has a doctorate in counseling. He's also trained in clinical pastoral education at the Atlanta Medical and Piedmont Hospitals. Lou's also the author of Listen, Learn, Lead, The Courage to Ask, The Power to Save. So we welcome you, John and Lou, and I'd like to begin, first of all, by just thinking with you regarding the term brokenness. In the dictionary, brokenness basically means fractured, separated, not functioning properly. And obviously, as we deal with our veterans, first responders, and families, as in the nature of their very business, many times they come to us with brokenness. I'm not saying that they are broken, but in many respects, we all experience some kind of brokenness in life. I remember one author who said that we all lead with some degree of a limp in our life as a result of life's challenges and problems. And so, John, I'd like to start with you. Out of the war on terror and these wars that we fought really since 9/11, one of the terms that seems to be coming into focus regarding specifically our veterans and first responders, if you will, is this whole term of moral injury. So I would like you to take a few moments, and perhaps our audience, this is the first time they've actually heard that particular term. If you could describe that for us and set the context.
Sure. So yeah, especially in regard to today's subject matter on brokenness, a lot of our men and women in uniform, soldiers, airmen, Marines, sailors, they've basically have gone into combat or been in combat zones, and they've experienced these events. From a PTSD standpoint, they've experienced a traumatic event. From a moral injury standpoint, they've experienced or gone through what you might consider a transgression. But nevertheless, however, whatever these things are, these events stick with us or stick with them. And, they do come back changed. They come back changed from the individual they were when they deployed. So, in the context of brokenness, I completely agree. It's not that they're broken, but they're changed, and they do have a sense of brokenness. But I guess the good thing about the whole concept of brokenness is that broken things can be fixed. Broken crayons can still color. So, moral injury is a kind of an up and coming term, which I'll get into here in a little bit in more detail. But, it really does really bring to point the whole concept of feeling like you're broken, feeling like you are just not the person that you used to be, and coming from a moral standpoint. So,
John, I've also heard that moral injury, I've heard people respond to it that it's like a soul wound. Can you, what does that mean, that if you've heard that particular term, that moral injury actually affects the soul, not just our emotions, but our very soul?
Yeah, well, a soul wound is a common term, especially when you're talking about moral injury, but also with PTSD. Edward Tick, he's a big time advocate for PTSD. He often refers to PTSD as a soul wound. And I would argue that what he's really talking about there is the moral injury. And so where this all comes from, when you're talking about moral injury, you're talking about a lot of existential themes. You're talking about shame, you're talking about guilt, and you're also talking about a lot of religious or spirituality themes, because you've got notions of forgiveness going on and condemnation. Somebody experiences something, they do something that kind of contradicts their own morality, and so they take on this sense of guilt, profound guilt and profound shame, to the point to where the conversations of condemnation come in, like, God will never forgive me, I don't deserve forgiveness, I'm a monster. And so these types of themes, if you will, in regard to condemnation and forgiveness, those are very innate to the soul. They are very connected to the soul. So when you do hear the term soul wound, that's kind of what we're talking about here, because what's being, I guess, tragically impacted is the person's soul. It's their innate character, because it's been damaged to the extent from a moral standpoint, and it's a significant issue, and it is a very apt description of moral injury.
Let me just ask one more question before I jump to Lou. You've mentioned PTS, post-traumatic stress, along with moral injury. What's the relationship between moral injury and post-traumatic stress?
Well, they're both combat traumas. I mean, well, you can have. They're both traumas. In respect to the veterans, I use the term as combat trauma. You definitely don't have to go through combat to have a traumatic event, especially in regard to either one of them, PTSD or moral injury. You don't have to go through combat. But from a veteran standpoint, they are both considered combat traumas. If you were to try to juxtapose the two, put the two side by side and kind of get an idea of the differences between the two, you could consider PTSD as a fear-based type of an issue, where fear is the pretty much the impetus of what's going on there. Moral injury, on the other hand, it's a guilt or shame-based phenomenon. So to carry this forward, you could say, for moral injury, for PTSD, for example, if you are, and I'm coming at this from a veteran standpoint, if you are, you're a veteran and you're, in a combat zone, and you're, say, for example, you're in a caravan going down, and the Humvee in front of you gets hit with an IED and it blows up, catastrophic issue, maybe some friends get killed, and you witness that. That is a traumatic event, and that event is literally, for lack of a better concept, seared onto the brain, and it becomes this basis by which all of these symptoms start coming that are fear-based. So you're dealing with, for PTSD, you're dealing with things like a startle reflex, memory loss, fear, helplessness, and horror. On the other hand, moral injury, where PTSD is, you're kind of dealing with being almost like the victim of a life-threatening event, or the witness of a life-threatening event. Moral injury is you're kind of the designer of a life-threatening event, if you will. You're the one that's actually doing the thing that is doing harm or doing something negative to another person, be that kill them, blow them up, or something that is just negative. And so with moral injury, you see a lot of examples of this. Me personally, there's such a, in today's culture, when there's a conversation about the issues that men and women experience, it seems to be always assumed that it's PTSD. But what I've noticed just from my own observation is that a lot of the things that we're seeing are probably moral injury. I'll give you a good example. The story about Chris Kyle, the sniper, the SEAL sniper, and I'm going off of how his story was portrayed in the movie. A lot of the things that he experienced, as far as being a sniper, and his targets that he took out included children, included women, included people who, you just don't think of as enemy combatants. And, on top of that, he had so many kills. And so that starts having an effect on you. And so, I say that to say that in that movie, there was a lot of discussion about how he had PTSD. And I would argue that a lot of what he was dealing with was likely moral injury, because of some of the things that he was exposed to and things he experienced when he was actually in combat. So, moral injury is a guilt, shame based type of issue. PTSD, on the other hand, is fear and helplessness. And so, like, for moral injury, you're the agent and designer of hostile acts, whereas PTSD, you're the target of hostile acts. Some differences between the two. PTSD, you have a lot of physiological arousal, meaning, panic attacks. You can have an elevated heartbeat. You can have sweating, your eyes dilate when you have like panic attacks and such. Moral injury, you don't necessarily have physiological arousal. You know, and also another difference is, you know, we go through life with these assumptions. You know, we have assumptions of trust, and we have assumptions of safety. So PTSD will actually damage that assumption of safety, and moral injury damages the assumption of trust. And it's, you know, you can have these different symptoms. Like moral injury, you're dealing with grief, guilt, and shame, and lack of trust. PTSD, you're dealing with memory loss and fear. But these two paradigms actually do share a lot of the same symptoms. For example, suicidal behavior is and something that Lou will get into here in a little bit, but suicide is actually one of the common traits between both moral injury and PTSD. But also there's anger and depression, which is really kind of one of the precursors to suicide ideation. Anxiety, substance abuse, nightmares, and insomnia are just a few of the many shared symptoms between both PTSD and moral injury.
Thank you, John. Lou, as John was talking, especially about moral injury just now, one of the differences that moral injury, you experience shame. I recall reading in some suicide prevention literature that one of the leading causes of those who either consider suicide ideations, or actually completed suicide, sometimes has to do with this whole concept of shame actually breaking that person into destructive behaviors. Can you speak generally to you know, the challenges that we have with suicide today in our military and truly in our culture, but also this whole idea of how shame could lead to suicidal behavior?
Yeah, I think what John was sharing along that line is it dovetails in. When I think of brokenness, for example, I think of a passage that you probably know well as a chaplain: "Do not grow weary in well-doing." And the problem is, a lot of times we begin to question if what we have done was well, if it was good, and then we grow weary. And if we're weary, our resilience begins to wane. And if we don't have good resilience, then all the other thoughts that are coming at our mind, nobody needs me, I failed my team, I failed my family, I failed my partner in law enforcement, whatever the case may be. And then we're filled with shame. And that shame is one of the leading causes of suicide. And one of the things that I often say is, you know, I've done over 1,200 interventions, but I say this, and people look at me cross-eyed when I say it: I've never met anybody that really wanted to die. Suicide is not the result of wanting to die, but it's the result of loss that leads to hopelessness. And if we're weary, if our resilience is gone, and that's compounded by the loss that we feel, we become a prime candidate for risk of suicide. I had a lady in one of my classes a few years ago that she wanted to rebuttal me in front of everybody. She said, I disagree. You know, there was a time when I wanted to die. I wanted to die. I said, well, I'll tell you what, it's a coffee break time. Let's take it offline and we'll talk about it a little bit. And the first question I asked her was, do you want to die now? And she said, oh, no. I said, well, what was it? How long ago was that? She said, about 3 years ago, I wanted to die. What was going on in your life at that point when you wanted to die? And that's when she had the deer in the headlights kind of look, and she began to realize that what I was saying was true. Her husband had asked for a divorce. She was going through chemotherapy. He didn't want to be married to someone who was having health issues. And so she was experiencing physical loss. She was experiencing relationship loss. There was a loss there. Again, I'll say it. I've never met anybody that really wanted to die. Suicide is not the result of wanting to die. It is the result of loss. And that loss, if our resilience is low and we feel broken and we feel weary, then that increases our risk substantially.
Yeah. You know, Lou, I believe the military will suffer maybe 22 suicides a day. and that's pretty close even to the civilian population. Perhaps I'm sure you would know, but my concern in this COVID environment in which we still live since March, there's been a lot of loss. We've lost the ability to leave our houses, to go to our favorite restaurant, to go on vacation, to do so many different things. We've lost financially. We've lost the ability to be with others. I would, based upon what you say, that suicide has to do with loss as well, that we could, let's say, project that our suicide ideations or suicides could actually start going up as a result of what we've just experienced with the COVID-19.
Oh, absolutely. That's the thing that I began to think about back in March. I was actually teaching a workshop for teachers the day that the governor shut down the state, and we had to just disband for the second day. We were teaching the assist workshop that day, which you're familiar with, and we weren't even able to continue the second day. And my concern was, okay, we're going to get past COVID, but the second wave of crisis is going to be the mental health crisis. And with mental health crisis comes the risk of suicide going up. So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, and I hate to be a doomsday guy, but last year the suicide rate was 48,000 across the U.S. A disproportional number of those were veterans. 20% of those were veterans, even though the statistics shouldn't be that high. And so we were at 48,000 last year. I'm fully confident. I hate to say that word. I'm fully confident we're going to be over 50,000 this year. By the time we run the numbers, sometime late in August of 2021, when all those numbers finally come together, we will be at over 50,000. And unfortunately, a lot of those were going to be veterans, and a lot of them are going to be law enforcement. I was reading an article just this past week. A doctor in California, in the past 2 months, he has said he has seen more patients with suicidal ideation or attempted suicide in the past 2 months than he typically sees in a year's time. Mm-hmm. So yes, I do believe that the suicide risk is going up. And we have, at any given time, you have 1 out of 20 people who have thoughts of suicide. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, most of them do not succumb to that thought. One of the things that I teach people all the time is suicide is just a thought. So let's talk about that thought. We don't act on every thought we have. I mean, God knows I would be in jail right now if I'd acted on every thought I have. My wife would, or I might be dead because I would be in the woods because a frying pan is upside my head because my wife acted on every thought she had. No one acts on every thought that they have. And so let's talk about that thought.
It's interesting. You're saying that sounds right. I totally agree with you. But when you say let's talk about it, now that takes a level of trust in a relationship. If I'm an officer, a law enforcement officer, and I tell my my sergeant or my police chief that I've thought about it, I could lose I may be given a desk job, or if in the military, I may lose my flight status or may lose my security clearance. So there's a risk, Lou, in what you're saying, to kind of talk to people at this particular level. So how do you respond to that? I mean,
that is a quandary, isn't it? I mean, that's the thing that people are afraid of. I have been in the park in Peachtree City at night talking to a veteran who happened to be in law enforcement that was struggling. A lot of police officers are afraid that they're going to lose their job. I was teaching in a workshop with probably 30 chiefs from all over the state of Georgia last year. And it was sponsored by the Morrow Police Department last year, and we all convened in Morrow, Georgia. I had a chief in the group who said if any of our officers say that they're struggling with suicide, they are not just put on desk duty, but they have to turn in their resignation. And that got a lot of discussion. Same thing happens in the military. If we have a soldier who's struggling with suicidal ideation and that unit's about to deploy, are we going to want that soldier to go downrange? That's the unanswerable question. What is going to be the intent if he goes downrange? Is he going to put himself in jeopardy if he goes downrange? And if he does put himself in jeopardy, is that going to put other people in jeopardy? And so his battle buddies might have an issue of trust going into that situation.
Well, Lou, I want to interject here because, especially in regard to these organizations, i.e. the military or even law enforcement, the unique aspect that chaplains have in each one of these is that they can go and they can actually talk to the chaplain. The chaplain, they're not mental health. They're not mental health counselors, if you will. But they do, there's some great benefits about going to the chaplain, even if you're not talking about something spiritual. You even talk about this. Chaplains, for the most part, have at least a rudimentary training in regard to suicide ideation. But one of the great things about talking to your chaplain is that it's not recorded.
Right.
So if you are active duty or you're in the reserves and you want to, you've got this thing going on to where you're, be it suicide or whatever, you can go to the chaplain, you can talk to him, and it's not recorded. It's not like you've got to log it in that you're, having therapy or anything. You can just go talk to the chaplain. And the chaplain is, there is a level of confidentiality there, especially, if you're talking, there no immediate self-harm to others or themselves. And you get into the telltale signs of a suicide, a plan, the motive, and the means to do it. But outside of that, the men and women who are dealing with these things can talk to their chaplains about it, and they can do so in a pretty discreet way without having to worry about a lot of the things that, being exposed, if you will.
Absolutely. I agree. I mean, there's a lot of things that I will take to my grave, and I know, General Carver, you're the same way. I saw a chat message just pop up here a moment ago. Mark said peers who are trained are also a great resource, and that is why we trained 17,000 people. That's why I'm really excited to be working with the Warrior to Citizen, because we're going to be training a lot more people. Because a lot of times, here's what happens. A lot of people think, oh no, my friend's thinking of suicide, I've got to take him to the emergency room right now. No, sometimes you just need to talk to them. And in fact, I had, back when COVID first popped out, end of March, I had a lady that called me a couple of weeks later. She had said something on Facebook. It alerted one of her friends who lived in another state. He called for a health and welfare check on her. The police showed up. The only thing they could do was take her to the emergency room. She said, yeah, I have had thoughts of suicide. She ended up in a hospital for 7 days, and COVID had just popped out. She didn't see a psychologist, psychiatrist, or mental health professional in 7 days. She said, I was going down the drain sitting in that hospital for 7 days. At least if I'd been at home, I could have gone for a walk, but all of her coping mechanisms had been taken away from her because someone jumped the gun and thought, oh no, I've got to do something drastic. And a lot of times what happens is, especially as Mark shared with peer-to-peer, I just need somebody to talk to. And if I can talk to somebody, it takes that weight off. Because when we don't have anybody, that's the power behind the question. That's why I talk in my book, the subtitles, the power to save. If we ask the question, it takes the weight off, because we feel abnormal. We feel like nobody else is thinking this, I must be strange. I must be nuts. No, it's a normal thought. Just like the weather changes, suicide is a thought we can talk about. Yeah. It's good stuff.
Well, let me just kind of tie some of the things that we've all been talking about here. First of all, there are some resources that our veterans, first responders, their families have, and we've mentioned chaplains. Chaplains have, at least in the military and most organizations, they have absolute confidentiality, as Lou, you mentioned what is spoken in that private setting is, taken to the grave by the chaplain. You also have this valuable resource of a peer or a friend that you can speak with. I would think that, first of all, the individual ought to know that those resources that are there, but the leadership of these organizations should also know, as far as referrals, what types of resources are available with chaplain, with peers, or other helping agencies. So I would think referral is very important. There's a self-care element to this, as well as a supervisory care of those under your charge. I think there's a responsibility there from leadership. Would you like to speak to one of those, John?
Well, as far as, I guess what resonates with me, what you just said, is the sense of self-care. And, one of the most effective things that I think can be done is socializing yourself. When we, coming at this from a brokenness standpoint, one of the common characteristics is, people withdraw, and they withdraw into themselves, both mentally and physically, from a standpoint from society, and that it's just them. And when it's just you, and it's just you by yourself, man, you are at the mercy of the enemy, and it's easy to get beat down. And so one of the things that I often speak to is, and again, this is one of the primary tenets of therapy for moral injury, is resocialization. Getting out into the community or getting in and amongst your peer group. From a veteran standpoint, one of the most common themes that you see and hear about is that you just can't relate to the people you're around now. When you transition from active duty to the civilian world, it is hard, and I know this firsthand. I mean, it was the same way for me. It's hard to relate or feel like you're relatable to a lot of people who've never experienced a lot of things that you have. And when you're in that environment, it's easy to kind of just withdraw and kind of just be a lone wolf and kind of just do your own thing. But that's kind of where you're really susceptible to a lot of bad thoughts, if you will. So I always recommend, get re-socialized, to get out there, find groups that you think, if you're a combat veteran and there's just no way, and this is a reasonable perspective. It's really difficult for somebody who's never been shot at, or for somebody who's never shot someone, to really relate to you and your experiences. And so it's important that we get into those environments of people who have experienced those things, so that you have a battle buddy, a swim buddy, that you have an accountability partner, if you will, but somebody that you can just talk to, that knows who you are, because you're so relatable. But again, there's three different major approaches to moral injury when it comes to therapy. Socialization is one of them. Spiritual aspects are another, and individual therapy is another. But based on your question, what resonated with me was the re-socialization and getting out into the community and getting out around people, and that is one of the most self-care things that you can do in respect to brokenness and becoming unbroken.
Lou, I want you to speak to that, because I think we have a challenge today in today's iPhone, texting, messaging generation. There was a book a few years ago that came out, Bowling Alone. We don't have bowling leagues. We don't do things together. We keep our nose in some kind of digital device. So talk to me about the challenges of how we break through for socialization, especially in the area of suicide prevention, to get folks once again to socialize with one another.
Well, I think that's true what you said, the social media. I think one of the things that is good right now with social media, and the reason we were having this discussion, I was pulling up my phone to look for a post that my youngest son had done just a few days ago. He is an Atlanta fireman, EMT. And other night I was reading a post he put out. He was at the station in Atlanta, And he was just, his words were a little different. You know, he was saying, I'm numb. He's 22 years old. And I asked him the other day, I said, how many murder scenes have you been on? He said, I don't even remember. How many suicide calls have you been on? He said, I don't even remember. So he is to that point now where he's numb to it. And so from the standpoint of there's a lot of folks out there posting stuff on social media and nobody ever responds, or they're crying out for help. And so what we need to do as peer-to-peer or as professional to peer, whatever the case may be, when we see it, we need to do something about it. Mm-hmm. I think about, I often quote Henry David Thoreau when I start my workshops. He said in his book, Walden, back in the 1800s, it is not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. And the reason I say that is because I have been to so many funerals or visitations at the funeral home to convey my condolences to someone who took their life. And people that know what I do, they come up to me and they say, we didn't see this coming. And a lot of suicide training out there talks about signs. If you Google suicide intervention, look for this sign, look for that sign, look for these signs. Teenagers, for example, 1 out of 5 teenagers will never show any signs. And so we say, well, gee, that's the 1 out of 5 that's going to die. No, it doesn't have to be that way. It's not about the signs. It's about the circumstances. And so even if everybody's posting stuff on Facebook, oh, it's a wonderful day, it's a sunny day, it's a beautiful day, but you know that they just got diagnosed with cancer, or you know they just got a divorce, or you know they just lost their job. Is it really a sunny day? I want to dig down into their circumstances, because you're saying it's a sunny day, but you're going through a lot of stuff. Who do you have to talk to about that? Right. And that's why I called my book, Listen, Learn, Lead. We've got to be willing to listen.
Right. You know, I heard the saying that we may have 300 friends on Facebook, but who do you call at 2 o'clock in the morning? And I think we need to know that it is a lonely world. And I want to go back to you, John. You know, we're talking about socializing, people needing to connect, looking for signs, people being accountable to one another. I understand in moral injury, the difference, and you mentioned it, in PTS, you're sort of a victim of guilt or fear that has plagued you because of a situation. Moral injury, it seems to me you're a victim of someone breaking that trust that you have with them. There's an element of betrayal often that takes place in moral injury regarding an event that may have occurred by a legitimate authority who directed something to take place, into a firefight or into a situation where the law is being broken, and something happens and there's a betrayal of trust. It can be a betrayal of trust within relationships. Can you speak to that, of how that almost hampers or prevents the intimacy of relationships, which Warrior to Citizen tries to help bring healing to veterans and first responders who have been victimized by a betrayal?
Yeah. Well, moral injury, you're right. Betrayal is a critical aspect to understanding what moral injury is. You know, when you get into the definition of moral injury, good luck, because I mean, there is no specific definition of what moral injury is. There are some understandings, but you know, if you're trying to compare it to PTSD, you know, you can go to the DSM and you can get a very succinct, understood, well-constructed, constructed understanding definition of what PTSD is. Moral injury, you're not going to find that. Moral injury is not even in the DSM. DSM. Moral injury is a pretty novel concept, quite frankly. I mean, it really just came into creation about a little over 20 years ago. And Jonathan Shea was the first one who actually kind of proposed the concept of moral injury. And, you know, very similar to what you said, his definition was it was a betrayal of something that is right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high stakes situation. And so you do see those nuances of betrayal. But, you know, going back to what I was saying a minute ago, there is no one definition. There, if you were to do a research, a literary research on moral injury, the last time I did it, I think I identified about 13 or 14 different definitions of what moral injury is. And so the best way to understanding moral injury, instead of looking for distinct definitions, is kind of identify what the themes are. Now, the themes of moral injury, which is what you find in throughout most of these definitions, is a transgression, a betrayal, and a spirituality, and some sort of leadership or authority figure that's in there. And so what I mean by transgression is the actual act of doing something. You know, for moral injury, remember, you're the designer of hostile acts on somebody else. So a transgression could be the pulling of the trigger, or it could be something a little on the opposite end of that understanding. It could be the failure to do something that you feel that you should have done or could have done. That's a transgression. And then, of course, betrayal. You know, Jonathan Shea, from his perspective, he put betrayal on an external standpoint outside of the individual. There was betrayal by the leadership, the commanding officers, or there was betrayal by the United States because they were in a war, the Vietnam War at the time. And that's who he was seeing, by the way. When he came up with this, he was seeing Vietnam veterans. And so they were dealing with their experiences in Vietnam. And so a lot of them did have this sense of betrayal by either their commanding officers or by the country for being there, then they shouldn't have been there. But as the concept has evolved over the past 20, 30 years now, you start seeing the concept of betrayal becoming more than just outside of the individual, but inside the individual. It becomes this concept of betrayal of self, you know, to where, you know, I did this thing, I knew better, I was not raised this way. My morals, you know, I knew what my morals are, but I still did this thing. So therefore, I betrayed myself, or I betrayed, my parents because they raised me better. You know, so the sense of betrayal becomes more internalized, or rather, it can be just as internal as it can be external. And then, of course, another aspect of moral injury is the spirituality side. And understanding what moral injury is, and understanding the various definitions of moral injury that are out there. A key component, in addition to the things I just said a minute ago, is spirituality. It's because you're, like I said earlier, you're dealing with these themes of forgiveness and condemnation. But I hope I answered your question, especially in regard to your statement of betrayal.
Yeah, certainly. And Lou, I'm gonna reframe this back to you, because John just mentioned that sometimes based upon your worldview and your spirituality, if you will. So I would imagine the way we look at suicide prevention also has to do with one's worldview. Can you speak to that? Because there's probably some differences on life and death and suicide prevention based upon where you are from a worldview perspective.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that I will often ask people, and it's not that I'm trying to thump the Bible on their head or anything, but I will often ask them, do you have a faith background? And if they say, yeah, I do, then one of the things that I'll often say, was there ever a time, I know you're going through a struggle right now, was there ever a time when your faith got you through something? And it's been amazing how many people, I had a soldier who reflected back on when he was 10 years old and his grandmother died. And he said, my grandfather was a rock. He got all the cousins together and he prayed for us. And then we went outside and played kickball. And we felt so much better. And I said, you got that same DNA inside of you. You got your grandfather's DNA inside of you. So let's go back and try to recapture that faith that you had at one time, because it'll help you get through. If someone says, no, I'm not a person of faith, then the next question that I might raise is, what do you feel like your purpose in life is? Because right now they may say, I don't have a purpose. Well, let's talk about that. What did you used to feel like your purpose was? And because everybody has a sense of purpose. If we don't have a sense of purpose, regardless of our faith, why am I here? Why am I here? What's the purpose of anything? And so with or without faith, I can talk to somebody about their purpose. And it may be just, I got to stay here to keep my dog alive, my companion dog, that nobody else is going to be able to take care of my dog like I can. That's a purpose. Let's work, let's drill down on that and use that as our reason for staying alive. You know, several years ago, a movie came out on Netflix. It was called 13 Reasons Why. And it portrayed a young girl who took her life, and she gave the 13 reasons why she did. My responses to that is, you can give me 13 reasons why you want to die. Let's find one reason why you want to live. And that one reason can overcome the 13 reasons why you would want to die. And so that's what and it may take time. It might mean that I've got to go into the hospital for a while, but more often than not, I'm going to say that again, more often than not, it's simply someone coming alongside them so that they are not alone. Yeah. And it's a peer, it's a grandmother that loves them. It's a son. My son reached out to me. You know, I was at Fort Jackson. When I saw you, Doug, at Fort Jackson, 10 years ago, I think you were up there for a monument, new monument that was being ordained into the chaplaincy. But I was having suicidal thoughts. And my son came from Charleston Air Force Base to check on his dad. And he's the one that saved my life. If we've got people in our life that are willing to dig down in the difficult times, that's what it takes. And he helped me, he reminded me of what my purpose was. Because somewhere in all the muck, I had lost sense of that purpose.
Hey, Lou, thank you. Hey, we've got just a little time remaining. And so what I'd like to do with both of you, John, I'll start with you. You know, oftentimes we have these webinars and afterwards it's kind of the so what? And, you know, we're taking some pretty complicated and deep subjects. We're dealing with them in less than an hour. So, John, if you could tell us the so what, in this case, the application, you know, why, as we work with veterans, families, and the first responders, why is it important for us to have this discussion, albeit cursory today, on moral injury, especially as it applies to brokenness? And then Lou, we'll ask you that same question. What's the takeaway today for the audience as a result of the last 40 minutes that we've all been together?
Well, I'll say this, you know, moral injury, you know, and I'm zeroing in on moral injury because it is such a new thing. And, you know, I think that a lot of things that we're dealing with are attributed to a very significant issue, which is moral injury. I'll give you an example. In the civilian world, I'm taking my military hat off and putting my civilian hat on. In the medical world, you start to see a lot of conversations and chatter about burnout, on how, you know, these doctors and these nurses and these first responders, these EMTs, these people who are in the medical community, and they're just getting burned out. And statistics are starting to show that they're getting out of the field in more and more volume than before. And so the question is, okay, well, they're burning out. Well, that burnout could probably be attributed to moral injury. And if we understand that it's actually a psychological issue and or a spiritual heart issue, more than it is just kind of being overwhelmed by the job, then we can address that and we can work on that. I mean, our first responders, especially in respect to what's going on right now with COVID-19, it's likely you have a lot of people in the medical community who are not able to save people. People are dying. They're dying on their watch, or they're dying on their table, or they're dying in their presence. And there's this sense of control, if you will, that they should have saved them, or they could have saved them, but they didn't. And so they're carrying that. And that is a sense of moral injury. And it's very indicative of what we're dealing with right now, especially in respect to COVID-19. And it's a significant issue when you're talking about our firemen, our first responders, and our doctors and our healthcare community. It's a significant issue that's probably what burnout is all about. It may very well be moral injury. And so when we are aware of this, we've been exposed to this, we can get a better handle of it, and we can address this to where we can, I guess, cut down on those washout rates and the rates where people are exiting the field.
Thank you, John. Lou, the same question to you as far as application of the time we've had here. You know, obviously we've talked about suicide prevention so much in our society, but why is it important right now as a part of our Warrior to Citizen resources?
Sure. The so what takeaway for me is this: 1 out of 20 people are thinking of suicide at any given time, and this year, 1 out of 300 of your friends is going to attempt suicide. That is the reality. 1 out of 300, over 1.4 million people in this country this year will attempt suicide. The only way we can curb and turn the tide on suicide, corporations can't do it, hospitals can't do it. It's going to be a wave of people who have learned the skills, or at least they're willing to talk to their friends and not just say, hey, I hope you're feeling better. No, we need to have a talk. Tell me what's going on. So when we begin to listen and talk with people and walk with them in their journey, that's when we'll begin to see the tide on turning on suicide.
Thank you, Lou. And John, you and Lou, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. And Warrior to Citizen is very fortunate to have subject matter experts as yourselves to be a part of the resourcing and the training that we have for our veterans, first responders, and families. We've only again just scratched the surface on these two topics. And so, audience, as you're listening today, if you want more information, of course, you can go to our website, warrior2citizen.org, warrior2citizen.org, and you can find more information about the resources that we have and upcoming training opportunities that are out there for you. I would also just remind you that we have one more webinar in this particular series, and appropriately, it will be on the topic of hope. And I believe that this has been a wonderful segue into that last webinar in this particular series. So again, John, Lou, thank you, both of you, for your service to our nation. Thank you for your service, even as you continue to provide support to our military veterans and our first responders and their families. Audience, thank you for spending this 1 hour with us on, I'm sure, a very busy day. There was a question regarding, we have military chaplains, but just a reminder, there are chaplains, volunteer and vocational chaplains in our law enforcement offices, in most of our institutional settings, or you can certainly find even local clergy or health care workers who would be willing to talk to those and establish that relationship with you. As we often say in the whole area of suicide prevention and moral injury, we're not alone in this effort. We are all in this together. So again, thank you for your time. Have a wonderful day, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you.